when Chris Hemsworth entered Redwood District Cafe, history changed. On that overcast afternoon, the skies seemed to hang low over the towering buildings of downtown San Aurelia. A gentle breeze carried the faint sound of traffic, mingling with the hum of voices from pedestrians busy with their lunch breaks. The air held a sense of anticipation, as though even the clouds overhead were waiting for something important to happen. In this bustling city, Redwood District Cafe was an oasis of modern style and refined ambience. Plush seating lined the spacious interior, which featured polished, dark wood floors that reflected the soft overhead lighting. Stylish, minimalist decor infused the cafe with a sleek, high-end feel meant to impress affluent patrons and visiting celebrities alike. From the wide front windows, customers could watch passers-by scurry along the sidewalks, shoulders hunched against a drizzle that threatened to turn into a downpour. Yet, inside the cafe, there was a curated calm, with smooth jazz playing overhead and the faint aromas of espresso and freshly baked pastries drifting through the air. For Chris, the cafe represented a slice of normal life in the midst of his hectic schedule. He had arrived in Santa Aurelia to attend a short press junket for an upcoming film. The Redwood District, known for its upscale boutiques and exclusive restaurants, seemed like the perfect place to unwind before he returned to his hotel. And so, wearing a casual jacket that did little to hide his recognizable features, Chris Hemsworth stepped across the threshold, fully intending to enjoy a simple cup of coffee and a moment of tranquility. A few customers glanced up from their lattes when they realized who had just walked in, but no one jumped to surround him or bombard him with requests. Most of Redwood District Cafe's clientele considered themselves too sophisticated to fawn over a celebrity in the open. They believed in maintaining a fave poise at discreet side glances, hushed whispers, and subtle phone snaps. It was an environment that typically suited Chris's desire to remain relatively low-key. For a few minutes, everything went perfectly well. The barista at the counter, a young woman named Melinda, smiled shyly as she asked for his order. Despite her excitement, she kept a professional tone, and Chris returned her kindness with one of his trademark grins. She recommended a specialty caramel macchiato that the cafe had recently introduced, and Chris, delighted by her enthusiasm, agreed to try it. He paid, took his receipt, and stepped aside to wait, casually scrolling through his phone while trying to appear inconspicuous. He didn't expect trouble. The Redwood District Cafe, after all, prided itself on offering top-tier service to a discerning clientele. Yet, from the corner of his eye, Chris noticed something amiss. A tall, broad-shouldered man was glaring at him from behind the counter, his starched collar pressed tightly against his neck. His name tag read Harold Gilroy, manager. At first, Chris assumed he might have done something unintentional to earn that severe look. But soon it became clear that Gilroy's displeasure was deeper, more personal than any small oversight a patron could commit. Chris tried to ignore the tension and wait patiently for his drink. Then, in a tone loud enough for many customers to overhear, Harold demanded that Chris step aside from the pickup area. It wasn't a polite request. Instead, it sounded more like an order barked out by an irritated drill sergeant. Chris complied, moving an extra foot to the left, a bit puzzled. Melinda placed the finished caramel macchiato on the counter with a polite smile. But Harold was there in an instant, intercepting the drink before Chris could pick it up. "We have rules here," Harold said, his voice echoing in the cafe's hush. "We don't cater to attention seekers looking to cause a stir. If you're going to disrupt my regular customers just because you're a movie star, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." For a heartbeat, Chris could only stare at the manager. The cafe patrons stopped speaking. Even the gentle hum of conversation fell silent. "I'm sorry," Chris answered, trying to maintain his composure. "I didn't realize I was causing any disruption. I only came for a cup of coffee." His voice was calm, but the confusion in his tone was palpable. "You're in the way," Harold insisted, doubling down. And if I see any more people taking pictures or crowding, you're gone. Most of the people inside the cafe sat quietly in their places, some pretending not to notice the confrontation while others watched in a mix of curiosity and shock. Chris frowned. He glanced around, noticing that no one was crowding him at all. Yes, a few folks had snuck a photograph, but the atmosphere was more subdued than one would expect with an A-list actor in the room. Yet Harold looked determined, almost eager, to escalate the situation. Chris opened his mouth to address the accusation and clear up any misunderstanding, but the manager cut him off. You know what? I don't need this trouble in my establishment, Harold said, shaking his head emphatically. I won't let Redwood District Cafe be turned into some Hollywood paparazzi circus. Take your drink and go. In the hush that followed, Chris felt his pulse quicken. He understood the importance of respect for staff and management in public establishments, but he also knew that the manager's behavior went well beyond a typical boundary. Harold Gilroy's aggression was personal, his voice thick with resentment. The tension left a bitter taste in Chris's mouth, stronger than any espresso. A cloud of injustice loomed, as though he were being singled out in an environment that purported to be welcoming. He didn't want to cause a scene. That was the last thing he desired, especially given the press events he still had to attend later that week. Look, Chris said, trying to de-escalate. I respect your cafe, and I'm sorry if my presence is making you uncomfortable. I can leave if that's what you want. But your tone, there's no need for that, Harold scoffed. Don't lecture me on tone. I run this place. I know what's best for my customers. You walk in here, star power on your sleeve, and think you can get special treatment. Not in my cafe, Hemsworth. Not here. Chris gently placed his hand on the counter, stopping himself from replying with the anger that threatened to surface. He drew a breath, forcing himself to remain poised. He dealt with tabloid rumors, pushy fans, and all sorts of corporate oversight. This, though, was a smaller injustice. Yet it stung. I don't want special treatment, he said, controlling his voice. I only wanted a coffee. Sure, Harold muttered. Well, your coffee is in the bin. And with that, the manager dumped Chris's freshly made caramel macchiato into a trash receptacle behind the counter. The coffee splashed inside, the wasteful act catching everyone's attention. Gasps rippled through the cafe as Harold pivoted, pointed at the door, and growled, Now get out. But Chris couldn't suppress the surge of indignation that coursed through him. Slowly, he stood tall. His normally gentle eyes flared with a hint of frustration as he realized how deeply humiliating this moment could become. He glanced over at Melinda, who looked on the verge of tears at the speckle unfolding. Something about Harold's posture, his chest puffed out, his jaw set, spoke of a deeper hostility that might have little to do with Chris personally. But the effect was all too real. Without another word, Chris turned and walked to the exit. The watching customers sat in a stunned hush. No one leaped up to defend him, though a few wore expressions of sympathetic shock. The manager's glare seemed to hold them hostage. In the swirl of complicated emotions, Chris recognized a single, unassailable truth. He had been singled out, humiliated, and ejected without cause from a place that was supposed to welcome patrons, no matter who they were. Outside, the drizzle had intensified. Chris stood under the gray sky, droplets slipping onto his jacket and darkening the fabric. He drew another breath. He could have let the frustration fester. He could have stormed off angrily down the street. But something about the whole event felt bigger than a personal slight. Something about Harold's approach suggested a systemic attitude, a pattern of unprofessional cruelty. And that's where Chris made his decision. Quietly, he pulled out his phone, took a moment to gather his thoughts, and let the world know what had just happened. He typed a few lines, describing the humiliating experience and the surprising rudeness from a place that boasted of inclusive, high-end service. He pressed post, uncertain of what might follow, but aware that by sharing his story, others might come forward with their own. He stepped back onto the busy sidewalk, merging with pedestrians and vehicles rumbling past. The Redwood district seemed disinterested in the tension that had just crackled inside that cafe. But the seeds had been planted. Chris's single tweet, concise, not scathing, but honest, would begin its journey across cyberspace. Within hours, it would gain traction, gather momentum, and spark a movement that no one in the Redwood district, including manager Harold Gilroy, was prepared to face. The post went live at 2:13 p.m. By 2:45 p.m., it had over 20,000 likes and the number kept climbing. Chris had not written it to stir trouble, but people reacted to the injustice. Soon, the Redwood District Cafe found its reputation hanging in a precarious balance. Comment after comment poured in from users who claimed to have had similarly negative experiences, not only with Harold Gilroy, but with the broader attitude that the cafe's management projected. Old stories resurfaced, a student who said she was ushered out because her clothes weren't fashionable enough, an elderly gentleman who insisted he had been spoken to with condescension, a local artist who believed the cafe discriminated against those who weren't obviously wealthy or influential. Chris watched the reactions with a mixture of concern and awe. He hadn't expected a flood of shared grievances. He had thought, in the moment of frustration outside the cafe, that perhaps the manager was just having a bad day or held a personal grudge against celebrities. But the stories people painted a portrait of a cafe that dressed itself up in exclusivity, priding itself on an image of refined excellence while quietly ridiculing those it deemed unworthy. By 3 p.m., reporters from local online publications had picked up the story. Headlines appeared quickly. Chris Hemsworth speaks out on Redwood District Cafe's rudeness. Beloved actor removed from upscale establishment with no explanation. And celebrity shares experience. Is Redwood District Cafe hiding a toxic culture? Taglines gave an air of drama to the unfolding situation. Yet behind the sensational coverage, Chris realized there was a broader story here. The Redwood District thrived on wealth, status, and appearances, and the cafe had become a microcosm of those very priorities. If the Redwood District Cafe turned away Chris Hemsworth, an internationally respected actor, what then did it do to people with fewer resources or less social standing? The afternoon wore on. Chris found himself inundated with calls from friends, staffers from his management team, and even a few fans who had seen the story blow up online. He tried to play it down, but the incident refused to fade. Online communities turned the cafe's rudeness into a rallying cry, raising issues of entitlement, discrimination, and unchecked authority. It wasn't simply a matter of whether a celebrity was ejected. It became a question of how power structures in certain high-end places imposed their will on unsuspecting patrons. Meanwhile, across town, in the upstairs office of Redwood District Cafe, manager Harold Gilroy paced anxiously in front of a floor-to-ceiling window. From here, he could see the drizzle clinging to the glass, the dampness painting the city in deeper shades of gray. The hum of voices from the cafe below floated up, muffled by the walls. He had returned to his office immediately after escorting Chris Hemsworth out, feeling triumphant at first. In his eyes, the cafe had once again maintained its standard of exclusivity, refusing to bend to the circus of celebrity. But his satisfaction was short-lived. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from corporate, from fellow managers in other branches, from concerned staff. The Redwood District Cafe was about to face a PR disaster, perhaps the biggest the brand had ever seen. Harold's mouth felt dry as he read some of the messages. Corporate had discovered the growing social media storm. People were threatening to boycott, demanding an apology for what they considered appalling behavior. The brand's carefully constructed facade of sophistication was crumbling under the weight of negative attention. Harold's prideful stance began to morph into something else of fear. He had always believed Redwood District Cafe was his domain. He had built a reputation as a strict manager who didn't tolerate nonsense from customers or employees. It was how he believed the business thrived in such a competitive market. But now, all that carefully cultivated authority was threatening to collapse in a single afternoon. Downstairs, Melinda, the barista who had served Chris's coffee, watched in grim silence as a few customers walked out, grumbling that they wouldn't be back until the place fixed its attitude. She exchanged anxious glances with her fellow baristas, who were equally unnerved. Rumors buzzed about an official apology or a corporate statement. Some staff members worried about losing their jobs if Redwood District Cafe took a serious hit. A few didn't even disagree with the manager's approach on principle. They simply feared the fallout of the negative coverage. But Melinda felt differently. She had seen the look of quiet hurt on Chris's face as Harold threw away the cup she'd prepared with care. She had never felt so ashamed of her workplace. By 4 p.m., Chris sat in a quiet hotel suite, glancing out the window at the rain-soaked skyline. His schedule for the evening had mercifully opened up, giving him time to reflect on everything that had happened. He brushed aside a call from a tabloid reporter wanting an immediate statement. His earlier tweet had ignited a discussion, perhaps even a controversy, far bigger than he'd anticipated. He wondered if there was a way to steer this conversation into something constructive. Yes, he felt humiliated and frustrated, but he also recognized that the Redwood District Cafe's attitude toward its customers was just a symptom of a deeper cultural problem. In a city like Santa Aurelia, where wealth and connections often determined how people were treated, the cafe's approach wasn't exactly unique. This was about power, prejudice, and the abuse of authority. As the rain outside softened to a mist, Chris decided to dig deeper. He opened his laptop and scanned the countless messages from users sharing negative experiences in Redwood District Cafe. Some of them included details of rude management, unspoken rules regarding personal attire, or subtle but real discrimination against anyone who didn't exude a certain level of affluence. He even found stories from ex-employees who claimed they were fired for not meeting superficial standards or for speaking up about management's oppressive behavior. The more Chris read, the more disturbed he felt. Around 5 p.m., a message popped up from a name he didn't recognize. I saw what happened at Redwood today. Please help me bring the truth to light. Attached was a link to a private discussion forum. Chris frowned, unsure if this was some hoax, but he clicked. The link led to a small online group calling themselves Baristas Against Corruption. Inside this group were threads documenting the Redwood District Cafe's questionable practices, forging of certain health inspection documents to expedite expansions, intimidation of staff who tried to unionize, wage theft. The group's members included both current and former employees, as well as a few concerned patrons. They lacked the voice or platform to expose what they believed was systematic corruption in Redwood District Cafe's management hierarchy. Shifting in his chair, Chris read post after post. It was a side of Redwood District Cafe that no casual customer would suspect. On the surface, the brand boasted exclusivity, refinement, and top-notch service. Underneath, it appeared the chain's leadership condoned intimidation tactics, hidden discriminatory policies, and constant corner-cutting to maintain the cafe's glossy image. Chris's ejection had simply revealed the tip of a much larger iceberg. His mind turned to Harold. The manager obviously thrived on a sense of power. But from these accounts, it seemed Harold was not alone. Many cafe managers across the chain possessed a similar mindset, as though the corporate office had decided that intimidation and humiliation were the best ways to keep undesirables away and brand prestige high. The Redwood District branch was apparently the flagship store, where standards were the most rigid and managers took the greatest liberties in enforcing them. Chris had wanted a peaceful afternoon, but fate had thrust him into a conflict with bigger implications. He thought about ignoring it, letting the buzz fade with tomorrow's news cycle. But then he recalled the utter humiliation he'd felt, the sight of good coffee wasted in a display of dominance. And he remembered all the faces of the staff who clearly disagreed but felt powerless to intervene. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and made a decision. He couldn't just let this pass. He had a platform, and if what these baristas were saying was even partly true, Redwood District Cafe was a place where cruelty was more than an accident. It was ingrained in their method of operation. At 6 p.m., Chris composed another message and posted it across his social media platforms. He kept his tone measured, but he included some of the stories he had learned from employees and customers. He didn't accuse Redwood District Cafe of every wrongdoing in existence, but he invited people to come forward if they had experiences related to the brand's questionable practices. He urged caution and respect, emphasizing that this wasn't about punishing employees, but rather about holding those in power accountable for the policies they enforced. He concluded his post by saying, "No business should thrive at the cost of people's dignity." The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Within an hour, comments began piling up. Many were supportive, praising Chris for using his platform to stand against apparent corruption. Others were skeptical, demanding concrete proof. Some defenders of Redwood District Cafe claimed the brand was simply selective and had every right to create an elite environment. But for every naysayer, there were 3 or 4 voices sharing personal stories of injustice and mistreatment at Redwood District Cafe branches around the country. By nightfall, mainstream news outlets were running stories on the controversy, though Chris suspected they were drawn more by the star power of his name than by genuine concern. Still, publicity was publicity, and it helped turn the spotlight onto the cafe's management practices. While Chris worried about whether he was setting himself up for a legal backlash, he pressed on. He reached out to the Baristas Against Corruption group, asking questions about their evidence and offering to amplify their voices if they wanted to go public. A few members expressed excitement. Others were hesitant, fearing retaliation. Chris understood their concerns. Going up against a powerful chain of high-end cafes wasn't a matter to take lightly. Redwood District Cafe undoubtedly had a team of lawyers capable of burying whistleblowers under legal threats. Chris, too, had to watch his words carefully. He wasn't about to slander a company without proof, but deep down, a realization took root. The humiliating experience inflicted upon him had merely been a catalyst. The real injustice had been happening to everyday people for years, and no one had listened until a Hollywood actor was ejected. In the days that followed, the Redwood District Cafe found itself scrambling to contain the fallout. Calls poured in from corporate executives, and internal memos leaked onto social media. Some memos seemed to encourage managers to cultivate an atmosphere of exclusivity by discouraging undesirable clientele, which was never explicitly defined but hinted anyone from the casually dressed to those who asked for a cup of water without purchasing a meal. The revelations infuriated many in the public. A wave of boycotts formed online, with hashtags urging customers to support local independent cafes instead of Redwood District Cafe. Manager Harold tried to maintain an air of control in the Redwood District branch, but cracks were showing. The staff was on edge, and whispers circulated that corporate headquarters was furious with him for antagonizing a celebrity in such a blatant way. If the Redwood District branch was the flagship, then Harold's actions had put the entire brand's future in jeopardy. An internal disciplinary meeting loomed on the horizon. And yet, Harold dug in his heels. In his view, Redwood District Cafe's entire concept was about exclusivity. Why was everyone suddenly acting like he had done something so wrong? He had simply enforced a standard that was set from above. one he'd learned from his own training with the company. But corporate, now under fire, was quick to distance itself from him. High-level statements insisted Redwood District Cafe prided itself on inclusivity and top-notch customer service, and that if any manager deviated from those values, they would face consequences. While Redwood District Cafe scrambled, Chris continued to read and respond to the messages swirling around him. Part of him felt a deep sadness. He had never intended to become the focal point of a large-scale controversy. But ignoring the cries for help or the calls for accountability seemed impossible. He found himself forging a connection with a small group of the cafe's ex-employees, some of whom were prepared to present their stories and evidence publicly if they could do so safely. They had stored old emails, voice messages, and receipts that showed repeated patterns of abuse. From wage theft to intimidation campaigns against staff who questioned their working conditions. With these individuals, Chris set up discreet online meetings. Over video calls, he listened as they laid out their experiences. Their voices trembled with lingering fear and anxiety. Some worried about being blacklisted in the service industry. Others felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, suspecting that if they had, perhaps Redwood District Cafe wouldn't have grown so bold. One ex-employee, Rachel, recounted her time working under Harold directly. She described how he would review employees' appearances, sometimes demanding they purchase expensive uniforms or accessories from approved vendors at inflated prices, all while paying them barely above minimum wage. Another barista spoke of the guest classification system that Redwood District Cafe used internally, a ranking from 1 to 5 that managers implemented to categorize guests. A rank 1 guest was someone the cafe considered premier, usually a well-dressed person driving a luxury car. Staff was expected to offer them top-notch service. Meanwhile, a rank 5 guest was questionable, and managers like Harold often found subtle ways to shuffle them out or discourage them from returning. The classification system was never made public, but internal documents listed as a service guideline. Chris listened, appalled. The manager's rude ejection of him was no fluke. It was the fruit of a pervasive culture. Over time, as Redwood District Cafe expanded, it had discovered that cultivating an image of exclusivity helped them sell more high-priced lattes and pastries. They built their brand around an unspoken rule. If you didn't fit the image, you weren't welcome. This was the same brand that publicly claimed to stand for modern inclusivity, and posted signs boasting a progressive, welcoming environment. Chris felt the weight of the stories accumulating in his inbox. He realized that a shift was happening online as well. While some individuals defended Redwood District Cafe, many more demanded a formal apology and accountability. A few local activists seized the moment, starting petitions calling for the cafe's owners to disavow discriminatory practices. The Redwood District Council even held a brief session to discuss the controversies, noting that San Aurelia prided itself on cultural diversity and acceptance. The negative press was bad for the Redwood District's image. Some council members pointed out that Redwood District Cafe's biggest draw was the tourist crowd who wanted a taste of local luxury. But controversies like these could scare away business. Amid this storm, Chris continued to weigh his options. He wasn't a whistleblower by profession. He was an actor, used to telling fictional stories, not investigating real-life corruption. Yet the people who reached out to him trusted that his celebrity status could shine a spotlight on their voices. He knew he needed help. He contacted a personal friend, a journalist named Celia Martinez, who had some experience covering corporate wrongdoing. After reading Chris's social media posts, Celia had already begun looking into Redwood District Cafe on her own. Now, with Chris's introduction to the whistleblowers, Celia set up interviews, cross-referencing documents to verify the claims. She was determined to publish a thorough expose if the evidence checked out. Every day, more employees came forward. Some from branches in other cities wrote to Chris's accounts, describing eerily similar management strategies, coded labels for certain customers, a standard script for turning away those deemed too unprofitable or fashionable, enforced purchases of uniform pieces only available through the company, mandatory staff meetings focused on brand loyalty that often devolved into intimidation sessions. By the end of the week, Chris was confronted with a sobering reality. Redwood District CAFA was not just one bad manager. It was a chain that thrived on systematic discrimination, hidden behind a veneer of class and exclusivity. All the while, the Redwood District CAFE tried to negotiate a settlement with the rising tide of public outrage. The brand's CEO, a polished executive named Marcus Briggs, made a public statement apologizing for the unfortunate incident involving Chris Hemsworth, but stopped short of accepting blame for any deeper wrongdoing. "We regret that Mr. Hemsworth had a negative experience at our Redwood District branch. Redwood District Cafe is committed to delivering the highest level of quality and service to all our guests. We are currently investigating this matter internally to ensure our standards have not been compromised." The statement was tepid and did little to quell the uproar. People still demanded a personal apology to Chris, along with assurances that Redwood District Cafe would change its discriminatory culture. But Briggs refused to go into specifics. Behind the scenes, staffers confided to Chris that the brand's top leadership was in panic mode, uncertain how to extinguish a scandal that threatened to unravel their entire business model. Harold remained manager of the Redwood District branch, at least for the moment. Yet many employees noticed he acted more anxious, his usual bravado cracked. He seemed to spend hours on the phone arguing with superiors, and his temper flared at the smallest mistakes in the cafe. Staff turnover increased as baristas quit, unwilling to endure the hostility from both management and the outraged customers who would come in just to pick a fight. Outside, protesters occasionally gathered with signs that read, "Coffee, not corruption," or "No more elitist cafes." Redwood District, typically known for its upscale quiet, found itself at the heart of an unexpected social justice movement. For his part, Chris gave a few statements to the media, reiterating that this wasn't just about him being thrown out. It was about the countless stories of ordinary people who deserved respect and fairness. He expressed hope that Redwood District Cafe could turn things around, but he also emphasized that real change would require a complete overhaul of the corporate culture. He kept in touch with Celia, who was preparing to release her investigative piece. Each day, she uncovered new angles, from questionable financial dealings to staff testimonies about management tactics that pushed legal and ethical boundaries. Celia compiled meticulously sourced records, screenshots, and testimonies, building a case that Redwood District Cafe's leadership might find impossible to deny. Finally, a turning point arrived when an anonymous Redwood District corporate insider leaked an internal document stating that managers were expected to protect the cafe's image by discouraging low-value clientele. It named specific strategies, instructing security to loiter near the entrance when certain types of people entered, or refusing refill requests for customers who didn't meet a purchasing threshold. This direct evidence fueled a firestorm online. The Redwood District brand had been caught red-handed instructing discrimination. The story escalated from a local scandal to a national conversation about the ways in which luxury businesses secretly enforced classist policies. With the public outrage at a fever pitch, Redwood District Cafe announced a press conference where CEO Marcus Briggs would address the allegations. Rumors swirled that they would oust Harold, claim ignorance of the more egregious policies, and promise reform. But the brand's credibility was at an all-time low. People wanted accountability, not just words. Many demanded that Redwood District Cafe compensate employees who had been fired or harassed, and that they dismantle the discriminatory rankings system entirely. Chris watched the countdown to the press conference with a knot in his stomach. Part of him was relieved that the public outcry had grown so loud that Redwood District Cafe could not simply brush it under the rug. Another part felt apprehensive. He had unintentionally become one of the figureheads of this movement. The final card remained to be played. Celia's exposé, which was slated to publish the morning before the cafe's press conference. With the leak of the internal document, Celia had more than enough evidence to run her story. She asked Chris if he wanted to be interviewed for a personal quote, but Chris declined, stating that his experience was already public knowledge and that the focus should remain on the employees and patrons who had truly suffered the cafe's discriminatory practices. He was ready to stand behind them rather than let celebrity overshadow their voices. What? Morning came with pale sunlight cutting through the dissipating clouds over San Aurelia. A sense of tension weighed on the Redwood District. People crowded around TV screens in offices, coffee shops, other than Redwood District Cafe, and their own living rooms, waiting to hear the official statement. At 9 a.m. sharp, Celia's investigative piece hit the internet. Titled, Behind the Glamour, Inside the Toxic Culture of Redwood District Cafe. It documented a chilling account of corporate memos, employee interviews, and legal experts questioning the cafe's practices. By 10 a.m., the story was trending nationwide. At precisely 11 a.m., the press conference began in a large, modern auditorium rented by Redwood District Cafe's corporate office. CEO Marcus Briggs stepped onto the stage, his expression composed yet strained. Cameras flashed, and reporters from various media outlets jostled for position. Briggs started by apologizing, unreservedly, to Chris Hemsworth for the incident. Then he claimed that Redwood District Cafe never sanctioned discriminatory practices. As part of company policy, he placed the blame on rogue managers. He promised an internal review, the development of new training programs, and a renewed dedication to inclusivity. But the reporters, armed with Celia's exposé and the leaked internal documents, were relentless. They questioned Briggs about the explicit ranking guidelines. They confronted him with testimonies of managers who said they were pressured to enforce these policies. Briggs stumbled. He tried to deny knowledge of the ranking system, but when a reporter read out an excerpt from a Redwood District Cafe manual that Celia had published, his face paled. He changed tactics, asserting that the manual was outdated and used by only a few branches without upper management's approval. The crowd of journalists pressed on, refusing to let him off the hook. The press conference devolved into an uncomfortable question, an answer session in which Briggs repeated the same vague talking points. By noon, Redwood District Cafe's stock had already taken a noticeable dip as investors realized the brand was in the midst of a scandal that would not be resolved easily. Meanwhile, inside Redwood District Cafe's flagship location, Harold locked himself in his office, blinds drawn against the outside light. He knew the blame would land on him, on managers like him, who had followed corporate policies too zealously. Yet he didn't see himself as a rogue manager. He saw himself as an obedient one. The difference now was that Redwood District Cafe was scrambling for self-preservation, and if that meant sacrificing him in the court of public opinion, they would do it without hesitation. A short corporate memo circulated that afternoon, stating that Harold was to be replaced effective immediately. Public relations staff framed it as a demonstration of the company's commitment to righting past wrongs. But many saw through the spin. Redwood District Cafe was jettisoning an inconvenient figure in hopes of saving its own skin. Harold realized, belatedly, that the brand he had served so fervently had no loyalty to him. Filled with bitterness, he fired off a scathing resignation letter. He blamed Redwood District Cafe's corporate leadership for instructing him in the very policies they now disavowed. He threatened to sue for wrongful termination if the company attempted to shift the entire scandal onto him. Despite Harold's combative stance, Redwood District Cafe didn't issue a response beyond acknowledging his departure. They likely saw no benefit in fueling a fight with a former manager while the public was watching their every move. Word spread quickly. Redwood District Cafe was in full damage control mode, forcing out managers, rewriting public-facing policies, and publishing a new code of ethics on their website. But skepticism remained high. Customers didn't forget easily, and more stories kept surfacing, highlighting the brand's hypocrisy. In a matter of days, Redwood District Cafe shut down several branches, claiming it was for renovations. Though most suspected the closures were financially motivated, analysts noted that the brand might never fully recover its old lustrous reputation. For the staff who remained, the changes were mixed blessings. Some felt relieved, hoping that the departure of managers like Harold signaled a real shift. Others expressed mistrust, believing corporates' attempts at reform were superficial. The Redwood District branch itself continued operating, but its once bustling interior seemed subdued. The lines of people waiting for a taste of exclusive coffee had thinned drastically. Where the cafe once brimmed with well-heeled patrons seeking a status symbol, only a scattered handful of customers remained, some out of curiosity, others hoping to witness firsthand the aftermath of the scandal. Chris followed these developments from a distance, maintaining contact with a few of the ex-employees he'd befriended. He watched Redwood District Cafe attempt to resurrect itself through public statements and rebranding efforts, paying close attention to how employees were treated. Through it all, he continued to emphasize the real heroes, the whistleblowers who risked their livelihoods to speak out. In interviews, he highlighted that anyone, celebrity or not, deserved respect and fair treatment in a public space. He admitted he had stumbled into this role almost by accident, but said that once he saw the scope of the problem, he felt obligated to help bring it into the light. And eventually, Redwood District Cafe launched a charm offensive, offering free coffee days, partnering with local charities, and stating their new commitment to equity and fairness. They even invited Chris Hemsworth to return as a guest of honor to begin a new chapter. The invitation arrived through his agent, accompanied by what amounted to a carefully worded apology. Chris wasn't naive. He recognized this as a calculated PR move. But he also believed in second chances, if they were genuine. After careful thought, he agreed to revisit Redwood District Cafe under one condition, that it would be part of a transparent event that included staff representatives and community members. He didn't want to be used as a photo prop to whitewash the cafe's history. If Redwood District Cafe wanted to make real amends, they needed to show it. When he finally stepped back into the Redwood District Cafe, months after his humiliating ejection, the place looked familiar yet somehow different. Gone was the aura of strict exclusivity. The decor remained sleek, but there were subtle changes, signs affirming, "Everyone is welcome here," and staff wearing name tags that read, "Ask me about our new standards." Corporate had replaced Harold with a calmer manager named Deanne, who seemed genuinely earnest about creating a better environment. Several baristas who had resigned in disgust found positions at other coffee shops, but a few who had chosen to stay told Chris they felt things were improving bit. By day, Chris stood near the counter and greeted staffers, acknowledging their courage in speaking out. He had half expected a swarm of cameras, but Redwood District Cafe allowed only a small presence of local press. The aim was to keep things relatively open, yet not turn it into a circus. Chris tested the vibe. He ordered a simple black coffee, no frills. When he took a sip, he nodded appreciatively. The coffee was good. Perhaps Redwood District Cafe could survive if it was willing to cast off its toxic foundations. During this brief public appearance, Chris spoke to the staff. "I'm not here to declare everything is perfect," he said. "We know there are still deeper changes that need to happen in many places. But I came because I believe people can learn and grow, if they're willing to acknowledge mistakes and take real steps to fix them. The conversation we started isn't just about Redwood District Cafe. It's about any place that's profits and exclusivity above human decency. I'm grateful to the employees who shared their stories, and I hope more of us learn from their courage. A modest applause followed from the small gathering of customers, reporters, and staff. There was still tension in the air. Old wounds couldn't vanish overnight. Yet for the first time since the scandal broke, Redwood District Cafe felt like it might become a place that valued integrity over facade. Looking back, Chris would often reflect on how a single cup of coffee that he never even tasted could spark a city-wide, then nationwide, reckoning. He hadn't planned to be a champion for corporate accountability that afternoon. He'd simply been looking for a moment of peace. In the aftermath of the Redwood District Cafe scandal, he learned something about the power of visibility and the responsibility that came with it. As a public figure, he realized that if he walked away and said nothing, the cycle of mistreatment might continue unabated. By speaking up, he hadn't just defended himself, he had helped amplify the voices of those who had quietly endured the cafe's toxic policies for far too long. The victory wasn't clean or easy. Some branches still struggled. Redwood District Cafe's leadership faced lawsuits, fines, and ongoing public scrutiny. Ex-manager Harold threatened legal action, painting himself as a scapegoat. The brand's CEO, Marcus Briggs, tried to salvage Redwood District Cafe's image by traveling from city to city, meeting with local communities and civic leaders. Whether these efforts were genuine or purely cosmetic remained to be seen. Yet one thing was certain: Redwood District Cafe could no longer hide behind a glossy facade, and other businesses with similar elitist models took note of the controversy, aware that the public would hold them accountable if they were caught discriminating or abusing their power. As for Chris, he went on with his acting career, continuing to shoot new films and appear at red carpet events. But the Redwood District Cafe saga left a lasting imprint on him. He understood how a seemingly small incident, being thrown out of a cafe, could reveal profound social issues about class, power, and exploitation. He stayed in touch with some of the whistleblowers, celebrating the moments when they found new, more positive work environments or when they received compensation for wrongful termination. Occasionally, they invited him to local coffee shops owned by independent baristas, places that thrived on genuine warmth rather than contrived exclusivity. Chris would drop by whenever he was in town, preferring now to support those who truly believed in welcoming everyone who walked through their doors. In the Redwood District itself, residents observed how the once coveted cafe's lines had dwindled, replaced by a more humble flow of everyday customers. Some said it had lost its allure. Others claimed it had simply become more honest. On some mornings, local activists still rallied outside, reminding passers-by that the brand's leadership would need consistent oversight. But there were also days when families crowded in, sharing laughter over pastries, trusting that their presence would be welcomed, not judged. The Redwood District Cafe was no longer the same, and that, in many people's eyes, was progress. Time passed, controversies ebbed, and public attention shifted. Yet the lessons remained. One person's story could bring down a towering facade of corporate pretension. One brave group of whistleblowers could open the eyes of an entire city. In quiet moments, Chris would recall that bleak, overcast afternoon, the sound of coffee splashing into the trash bin, and the humiliating order to leave. In the end, that confrontation became a catalyst, igniting a larger conversation on how we treat each other, and the lengths to which some will go to protect profit and power. It reminded him that real heroism sometimes begins at unexpected places, not with grand plans, but with a refusal to remain silent. As the conversation around Redwood District Cafe turned from scandal to the slow work of rebuilding, Chris continued to meet countless fans who thanked him for speaking up. Some who had personally suffered at the cafe told him that his intervention changed their lives, giving them the courage to stand up for themselves. Others praised him for shining a light on corporate misconduct. Chris always responded with humility, insisting that the true heroes were the employees and patrons whose stories had lifted the veil. His role, as he saw it, was simply to echo their truths so they could not be ignored. In the end, Redwood District Cafe didn't vanish. It was too large, too embedded, and perhaps too profitable to disappear entirely. But it no longer represented an untouchable bastion of elitism in the Redwood District. Under a more watchful public eye, it had to adapt. And if that adaptation brought about even a fraction of the change that whistleblowers hoped for, it would be a step in the right direction. When all was said and done, Chris Hemsworth's presence in that cafe had indeed sparked a movement. One that outlived the initial burst of media attention. It was a movement that called for fairness, accountability, and empathy in places that once thrived on subtle discrimination and silent intimidation. And even as the Redwood District returned to its daily hustle, the memory of those events lingered as both cautionary tale and testament to the power of speaking up. Don't miss tomorrow's special story at 7 p.m. Subscribe today.